One of the main questions being posed here is, how can human cognition take on a sustainable form? The answer I would like to quickly sketch today is this. Human cognition will take on a more sustainable form when humans realize that what humans call cognition, and what I call cognitions here with an S, so as to encompass words often used interchangeably with cognition, such as thought, mind, intelligence, thinking, etc., that these cognitions are the growing tips of processes that started long before humans were around. Let me say it again. What humans call cognitions are the growing tips of processes that started long before humans, processes that continue in embodied ways that are not only human. Cognition, thinking, mind, intelligence, whatever word one prefers, is a human representation, a human word, for something life has been doing for as long as life has been. Today, we often try and paint the human word cognition onto other forms of this process. We talk of plant cognition or animal cognition, and what most people sort of by default imagine upon hearing such terms is that these plants and animals have what humans experience as cognition. But plants and animals are different embodiments, and so this does not make sense. In fact, plants and animals do share the processes that humans have come to call cognition. Many of their ancestors probably had it long before ours, but saying they share the processes does not mean they have what humans experience as cognition. It is also important to realize that cognition does not depend on a certain brain or a certain body, though it does depend on being embodied. Again, human cognitions are like the growing tips of something much larger. Still, this means that we are all engaging in the same patterns of action, though they manifest very differently according to our bodies and landscapes. And by landscape, I mean something very specific. I mean areas of shared space encountered with particular statistical regularity by the embodied being. One might call it a niche, but only in the very loosest sense. This is an important and nuanced point to be understood if we want human cognition to be more sustainable. Namely, it is not wrong to talk of the intelligences of other embodied creatures, but it is wrong to imagine those intelligences are what humans have understood as human intelligence, which is why I use the term waymaking to point to this expansive, multidimensional process that has been going on since life began, but that manifests in humans as what we have come to call cognition. In our limited realization of the process, we call it cognition, but the process itself is much more expansive and has been going on much longer than anything like what we call human cognition. So, understanding this, we can begin to understand that the human manifestation is not the beginning or the end. Let me try and say it again, but another way now. From its beginning, life has been doing what we humans call cognitive in ourselves, namely making and finding and sharing better ways of interacting and communicating with itself towards new forms. For the sake of simplicity, let's call that process making way, or way-making. Way-making includes what humans have labeled cognitive, but it is not limited to it, because it is not limited to humans. All embodied beings make way through nested landscapes. All beings have a unique trajectory that is traced in a shared, meshed space. All beings must make ways within that space through interaction with it, through communication with it, through participation in problem solving and presencing, so as to continue to be and to be part of it. This is happening at all scales of life, and it is what at the human scale we have come to call cognitive or thinking or mind. It's one nested, very interesting, very amazing version of a process that manifests in many ways. For humans, cognitions are ways we create and use knowledge, some of it bodily and firsthand, and some of it, increasingly more and more of it, representational and secondhand. By representational here, I do not mean in brains. I mean things created by humans to interact and communicate with themselves and others. Humans have created numerous representational meeting places, landscapes that are navigated through words, through images, landscapes like literature, art, music, social media, and the internet. That we have created such representational landscapes is often taken to mean we are special. And of course, everything and everyone is special in some sense. But as I see it, this creation is a supplement to, not a break from, the ways all beings make in order to be and to continue to be. Again, ways they make to interact with, communicate with, participate in, problem solve, presence, and survive this shared space, this existence. We are all one another's shared space. And if you look for it, there are many examples of other sorts of beings making way, doing what we do, what we call human cognition, though they are not using human representations or these external meeting places with images and words. They are still doing what we use those to do, which is to problem solve, to communicate, to interact with, to presence and participate and survive this blooming, buzzing confusion. The human version of this, our cognitions, is only special if we do not understand humanity as continuous with and part of other forms of life, who are also doing the same things we do, problem solving, communicating, presencing, interacting with, participating in this real shared space. Though they do it with their own sorts of bodies, coming from their own sorts of developmental trajectories and in their own sorts of landscapes. And our secondhand representational landscapes, the ones of words and images, for example, are just not ones they often inhabit. The hard thing about understanding this, even for those of us who feel it is true, is that we only know our human cognition, and we default to painting that onto whatever we use that word to describe. I hope that looking at all of this as waymaking allows us to unstick from that mindset of thinking we can only experience the world through human cognition. But why should we understand what humans call cognition as waymaking, as making way? It is a beautiful metaphor and one already built into much of our language, but what else? If you already understand that human cognition is a matter of solving problems, which is always a matter of finding better ways to interact with, communicate with, presence and participate in shared space, then understanding thinking as waymaking might feel natural. But we can also explore this through more scientific means and examples. Though I will not go into any data here, I do want to describe some recent developments in our study of an area of the brain called the hippocampus. This area of the brain, to overgeneralize, as a short talk like this demands, is crucial to memory, knowledge acquisition, and navigation. And recent papers from reputable neuroscientists have shown that the ways we make in conceptual spaces are comparable to the ways we make in traditionally physical spaces. So the ways we make in these meeting places or representational areas are similar, at least in terms of the way the body processes them, to more traditionally geographical spaces. There are actually many possible examples of this from various disciplines, but I will focus on neuroscience and examples from the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences here, because that is the lab, or one of the labs in which I work to write my master in neuroscience, and I wrote it relative to this subject. The paper that I will discuss is called Navigating Cognition, Spatial Codes for Human Thinking, and it was published in Science in 2018. One of the press releases from the Max Planck Institute summarizing this paper when it came out reads as follows, quote, "Researchers propose a new theory of human thinking, suggesting our brain's navigation system is key," end quote. So as we make way in the world, in the hippocampal entorhinal area of our brains, there are two crucial cell types that are at work for us, that never stop: place cells and grid cells. To be fair, there are many other crucial GPS-like cells in this area of the brain as well, such as head direction cells, border cells, etc. But for this talk, I will just mention place and grid cells. Place cells in the hippocampus and grid cells in the close by interhidal cortex work to form a sort of circuit together that allows us to have orientation and navigation. Again, I'm generalizing, but it's the general idea. And this paper that I mentioned before suggests that this inner GPS or navigation system does more than just help us move in geographical space from A to B. It's also doing that in all the many other landscapes of our lives, if we think of them as landscapes, these meeting places or representational spaces that we've built through images and words and all kinds of other ways. We could call them conceptual spaces, cognitive spaces, thought spaces. The point is that this concerns not only geographical data, but also relationships between objects and experience. So these cognitive spaces also could be understood as landscapes of statistical regularity when they're modeled, at least. Not the process itself, of course, is just ongoing, but when we model these, they can be modeled as landscapes of statistical regularity, similar to those of other geographical landscapes when we try to understand them and look at what's regular in this landscape that has this positive or negative effect. So when you're reading a book of a certain genre, for example, you're in a cognitive landscape that is likely familiar to you in its patterns, even if the book is completely original, because it's coming from a certain developmental trajectory. It's probably why you chose that particular genre, because you like that genre. This is similar to the way the layouts of streets in many cities are very similar, or to take a really extreme example, how when you walk into a Starbucks anywhere in the world, it looks very similar to every other one. There's something about the way our bodies and our inner GPS works that aligns easily when the regularities are easy to understand and fit to ones we've seen before, or sensed before, not only seen before. Environments are built this way so as to be easier to recognize and navigate. And the reason they are easier to recognize and navigate and align with, fit to, is because of the way the brain's GPS works. This relational navigation, this relation between memory, knowledge, and navigation that sort of is the body, that you can't really separate all of these things except when we model them and study them. And the way our nervous systems tag to these regularities, and then after having navigated them, sort of more easily fit to them the next time they encounter them or something very close to them. They can kind of link into these trajectories, align, adjust, fit to what they're experiencing, and make way the next time and the next time with a bit more ease. The less geographical areas of our lives have properties that can be understood as something like landscapes in this sense. Statistically regular areas that we encounter regularly, that we move through when we are using these meeting spaces, or when we're in these meeting spaces using the words and images that we've come to know as those meeting places, these representational spaces of knowledge. The Nobel Prize winning discoveries of place and grid cells, which were first found in rodents' brains but were subsequently shown to also be present in humans, show patterns of activity that align the animal's position in space to each part of its encounter. So each position in space can be represented by a sort of unique pattern of activity when we model it. You can see this, that in this particular area, this particular pattern of activity, this particular group of cells will fire. But just like every Starbucks is similar and thus easy to navigate, there are significant amounts of statistical regularity that build this process into something that comes with more and more ease. So together, the activity of place and grid cells allows the formation of a mental map of the surroundings. And this paper says that this mental map is stored and reactivated during later visits. So it's almost like you build a little map of all these different landscapes, and anytime you re-enter them, you can just pull this little map out again. This is the model. Of course, this is the way many people think of it, that we build inner models. I don't think it's necessarily we have an inner model and we're looking at a little map somewhere inside us. I think it's much more immediate than that. The brain and body are much more sophisticated and don't need to bring out a little map. But when we model it, we can think of it as maps and models of those areas. That's pretty much the only way we can really start to understand it. So it makes sense to use this kind of language, but it's not like it's packed away somewhere so much as that the body itself is able to remember these alignments when in that situation, almost like music activates patterns, or the patterns are the music in activation. Anyway, but that's another discussion. In any case, these regular activation patterns in place and grid cells appear in the brain not only when a being is navigating geographical space, but also when they're learning new concepts or moving through this concept space, cognitive space, thought space, whatever kind of space you want to imagine, really, as long as it's regularly encountered and statistically regular when modeled. So in experiments testing this, they find that the entorhinal cortex is activated for these cognitive spaces or conceptual spaces in much the same way it's activated during navigation of traditional geographical spaces. And the paper suggests that this is a kind of sat-nav of the brain, a mental GPS. It sort of shows there's actually this sort of coordinate system that we can also apply to thinking and cognition and thought. So one can imagine these as many nested paths through the spaces of our many cognitive, representational thought dimensions. The point of all this is that we can start to begin to envision how we might understand cognitions as processes of navigability, or to kind of broaden it as waymaking, because navigation is used in a really specific sense in some sciences. But I do think of it as navigabilities. So these are ways we find through particular statistically regular landscapes. There would be much more to say about that, but I introduced this paper very briefly and generally just to show how blurred the idea of cognitions and navigations really can be. It's very specific, but it's also, we can really think of these as two different ways of assessing a common process, in a way almost like action and perception, depending on from where you're measuring. One thing might look like the perception and the other like the action, or vice versa. But we could always also say perception is always an action, and from some other nested level, an action is always a perception. It can be very similar with the way we think about cognitions and navigations, depending on where we're measuring them. But still, that doesn't mean that when we model them, they aren't very different. They are. How to hold this paradox is one of the big challenges, but I think we can do it. So here's another summary from those neuroscience papers, or the one neuroscience paper that I've talked about so far, and that is that humans think using their brain's navigation system. So that's just kind of, I'm putting that out there to connect this idea of navigability and cognitions. I believe what these papers are saying is that thinking and navigation are nested patterns of the same process. They're ways we assess an ongoing process that needs to be looked at very closely in order for us to understand it, but of course actually never can really be broken into all these different models and parts. But when we look at it like this, we can widen our notion of landscape and start to understand that it's not just the geographical landscapes that we're moving through every day, but also these many representational ones that we've created through books, films, conversations, and many other spaces that have structure and statistical regularity that can be compared to other more traditional landscapes like parks and buildings and cities. In this way, we can understand how human cognitions, thinking, mind, intelligence can be understood as ways we make, as navigabilities through representational spaces that have come to be so that we, one of the growing tips of life, can interact with, problem solve, communicate with, and participate in ourselves and in all that we encounter. This is what we mean by human cognition, and it is a scale of a process all of life is doing according to its own bodies and landscapes. This makes sense if we model existence as a dynamical, shared space that is itself comprised of many nested forms of beings making their way. Many nested forms of beings making their way, beings navigating, developing navigabilities. It's always changing, ongoing, dynamic. We can also zoom in and see that there are many nested landscapes that those beings navigate at once, be those geographical, social, representational, etc. And we can see that the patterns across all these dimensions. are composed of the same sorts of fractal-like trajectories, patterns we can zoom in and out of in multiple dimensions, like those of the interaction of place and grid cells, or perception and action, from the trajectories of cells to insects to plants to humans to cities to communities. We can move through this in a fractal sort of way and begin to understand from many different angles what all these words that might have appeared dichotomous up till now are actually different ways of assessing that we can do at different scales of the same process. So most importantly, when we talk of something like a city or a community, we can start to understand that the trajectories of all living beings there might need to be modeled or do need to be modeled, not just those of human cognitions, but what about all these other cognitions which develop in their own way through all these other different bodies and are ultimately necessary for us humans as well, as we're the sort of growing tips of many of those processes. So when they change, we change too. All embodied beings, be those birch trees, dogs, worms, octopi, bees, all these many beings are making way through various landscapes according to their bodies and forms of sensing. And these are their versions of what humans have come to understand as human cognitions. We can only know what these other waymakings are like if we develop ways to notice and represent their trajectories and their landscapes such that we take them seriously and, in so doing, widen our own trajectories and landscapes and begin to understand our own better too, because it's all nested together. But we do need to look at their unique bodily navigabilities and what they need from us such that our own cognition can support and sustain them, and such that we stop using this word cognition as if it was inside of a human head. For in a way, any human cognition is also the cognition of all these other beings. We are life finding better ways of problem solving. Our noticing of them is a kind of responsibility. We are life finding better ways of problem solving, interacting with, and communicating with and for life itself. We are now all worried about our existence. How will we survive? How will the planet survive? And billions of dollars are being put into simulating and modeling possible scenarios for the planet, these digital twins. But are we modeling this as only a human path? Are we only modeling human trajectories when we model our digital twins? Because perhaps, we're certainly missing something there. Because if this human path and cognition is just the nested tip of this growing larger process, perhaps the wider challenge is how to notice and model the navigabilities that are not human, but that of course change in effect and are entangled with those of the human. So when we create these digital twins, are they digital twins of Earth or of the human experience of Earth? Perhaps if we can model and simulate the Earth from many nested trajectories of beings in geographical first-hand spaces, but also in representational second-hand landscapes, then we will begin to find more sustainable ways to use human cognitions. If we really could understand the human scale as a nested part of life, this would be the obvious necessity that we learn how to see ourselves a bit like growth buds that have suddenly become aware of ourselves as part of the trees we depend upon. How can we create and model the many nested landscapes and trajectories of our shared ecological mesh? And how can we do this from the point of view of as many beings as possible? And how can we begin to think of ourselves as those beings, as literally part of them? And perhaps this is what we're trying to do already in building our microscopes, our telescopes, our time-lapse photography, in writing our books, all of this and all these other tools we build, including the digital twins, to try and understand the world. Maybe part of that is to try to understand the world from other positions, and maybe that is where the answer is. And so, to summarize again, cognitions are human forms of making way through encounters, though we mostly use terms like cognition, thinking, and intelligence when we are using representational or representationally tagged landscapes. All embodied beings are actually making way. In other words, they are also problem-solving, connecting, interacting, presencing, and participating in this blooming, buzzing confusion of our real shared space. Each body makes way differently, and each body makes way through multidimensional landscapes. When it comes to sustainability, could we begin to take landscapes such as literature and art and music as seriously as landscapes such as cities and offices? And can we begin to take the waymakings and trajectories and navigabilities, the vegetal and the animal and the insects and all beings as seriously as that of the human? Can we find ways to model and simulate these nested trajectories so as to better understand them? All of it structures our knowledge landscape equally, and all of it is nested into a larger trajectory that is existence. The hope is to begin to simulate possible existences from more than just the human perspective. This is one way human cognition might become more sustainable.